In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Matteo Cagliaro.
Good evening, everyone. I have a fancy mic, so. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Harvard Institute of Politics. My name is Matteo Cagliaro. I'm a junior at the college studying applied math to computer science and economics, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Student Committee. Now, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum. I am a citizen of Rome. Over the past decades, a similar assumption stood true as the unquestioned American leadership seemed indispensable to global political stability. Over the past few years, however, many of the assumptions that have shaped America's role in the world have started to be re-examined. From global supply chains to long-standing security commitments, all the way to competitiveness in the so popular age of AI, the US finds itself navigating a landscape far less predictable than the one that has defined most of our lives. At times, it seems like the public debate is fixed between two competing narratives. Now, one insists that American leadership is indispensable for global stability, while the other argues that we are undoubtedly witnessing a shift to a multipolar world order. These issues beg the question of what a resilient American economy should look like during times of such geopolitical rivalry. All in all, how should the US truly balance global engagement with national strength? Now, with these questions in mind, it is my honor to introduce our speakers for the evening. Oren Cass is an author, policy expert, and founder and chief economist of American Compass, a conservative think tank dedicated to rethinking economic priorities with a focus on family, community, and industry. He also served as the domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. Moderating this discussion, we then have Jake Sullivan, who served as the US National Security Advisor from 2021 to 2025. And as of 2025, he is the Kissinger Professor of the Practice of Statecraft and World Order at the Harvard Kennedy School. Now, without further ado, please join me in opening up tonight's discussion and welcoming our esteemed guests to the stage.
Thanks, everybody, for being here, and thank you, Oren. Oren is one of the most thought-provoking, interesting, and interesting is a word you don't hear that often about people who publicly comment on policy, publicly think about, write about, formulate policy. One of the most interesting and thought-provoking thinkers in America today. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be able to have this conversation. And you've written a lot and spoken a lot in the last year. You've been very busy, but you have a piece in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs called A Grand Strategy of Reciprocity. And before we dig into some of the more specific issues, would love for you to just take a moment to tell us what is a grand strategy of reciprocity?
Sure. Well, certainly thank you all for coming, and thank you to the JFK Junior Forum, and especially to you. You're someone I've really enjoyed talking with, and I think the areas of agreement and disagreement are always incredibly illuminating because there are many of both. So,
and somewhat unpredictable.
And I'm always surprised by which are which. So I've been really looking forward to this. So grand strategy of reciprocity, in my mind, it's important to contrast it, which is with what has come before. The way I think of it is that roughly since the end of the Cold War, the US has adopted a grand strategy that's gone by various names. I think the most descriptive is benevolent hegemony, which is the term that Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol pioneered. And the idea was essentially the US was in a position to be a global hegemon, and we should take advantage of that and exercise that role in a benevolent way. That the United States gained enormous benefits from being the uncontested sole superpower, uncontested military superiority, economic dominance, and we should preserve that, in essence, by making concessions to others along the way. We should preserve a free trade system, even if others were abusing it in various ways. We should spend what we needed to on defense, even if others weren't really spending as much as maybe they'd said they were going to. And while those were costs for us, the flip side was we would get all the benefits that came from being the big dog. And I think you could make a case that that actually worked in the 1990s, but I think over the past 25 years, it has become entirely unsustainable from both sides. I think we are no longer a hegemon, and as a result don't really get the benefits from it that we expected. And conversely, the costs have been much higher than we expected or certainly can bear at this point, both in the economic effects of the system of globalization and in our attempt to, whether you want to call it being the world's policeman or just being the guarantor of security in so many regions of the world. And so the idea of a grand strategy of reciprocity is to say, okay, what do we do instead? What other principle could we have? Because it's often positioned as, well, if you don't want to do that, then you're an isolationist, right? We're going to sort of just hunker down and ignore the world. And I don't think that's right. I think we certainly benefit enormously from engagement in the world, but we have to ask, on what conditions do we benefit from engagement? And it's a little bit oversimplified, but it's what you need in as a starting point. It seems to me we benefit when our relationships are reciprocal. And what I mean by that is that in the economic context, we benefit from trade. Certainly trade can be a wonderful thing if the trade is balanced. If we are trading with other countries that are committing to both buying and selling, and therefore give us the opportunity to buy and sell. And that contrasts dramatically with what we have had, where there are a lot of countries that drive growth in their own economies, create jobs for their own workers by running big export surpluses, with the U.S. as the consumer of last resort. We have absorbed everybody else's surpluses and really seen a decline in our own industrial might as a result. And then likewise on the defense front, we should certainly want to have a strong coalition of countries committed to mutual security, but we don't want it to be one where everybody else is depending on us. We actually want it to be one where everybody is a net contributor to the collective defense. And what that means is that in different regions, other countries take primary responsibility. So, in the Pacific, Japan, Korea, Australia are the countries that should first and foremost be responsible for deterring China. We should certainly want to help and contribute to that effort, but we need to get away from the dynamic where they're sort of, asking if they've eaten enough of their vegetables to get dessert, or asking if they've done enough of their homework to go out and play, and the US does the rest. It should be, okay, are you actually confident you are doing what you need to do to achieve your objectives? The same with Germany and other powers in Europe vis-a-vis Russia. And so we can get into, okay, how exactly would you affect that? But there's nothing stopping us from saying we would like to have a large economic and security bloc, but if you'd like to participate in that with us, it needs to be on these reciprocal terms. It needs to be balanced trade. It needs to be defense commitments. And then the third element is it's going to have to be what I would just call China out. That China obviously cannot be a part of this. And it will not work if the US wants to decouple from China, but the partners don't. And so there's going to have to be a holding hands on how we deal with China and with other countries that ultimately choose to align in that direction.
So I want to take each of those three pillars of the grand strategy of reciprocity: balanced trade, essentially burden sharing or burden owning, I think is a phrase you've used, and China out. Starting on the balanced trade question, is your view ultimately that the United States should basically not be running a current account surplus, that we should be exporting as much as we're importing, roughly?
Yes.
And is your view that that is achievable over some kind of defined time horizon? Like how long would it take to pull that off if the preferred policy that you advocate for was actually put into place, to go from where we are to where we need to go? Can you talk a little bit about what the costs of that transition would actually look like, particularly for the people who you spend a lot of your time thinking about and advocating for, working people in this country who are basically just trying to make ends meet?
Yeah, I think it's probably on the order of a decade-long process. If you look at our current account balance now, we have roughly $1 trillion annual deficit. So for purposes of numbers, we're roughly importing $4 trillion and exporting $3 trillion. And I think it's important to say, like, why is that a problem? Because there's one view that, well, free trade automatically benefits everybody who participates in it. We learn about comparative advantage. What could go wrong? It's important to recognize that all of that narrative of why trade benefits both sides actually assumes that the trade is balanced. If you go back and think about when you do your problem set, right, to prove comparative advantage works, it's always like, well, for me it was fish and sweaters. It always tends to be two things that depend on the natural endowments of the two places that are trading. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you switch that to like semiconductors for soybeans. And it certainly doesn't make sense when you switch it to semiconductors for no soybeans. Because what we are trading, it's not that we get the stuff for free, although frankly that would weaken our industrial base too. But what we're trading instead is assets. So the relationship, if we're getting $1 trillion extra of stuff, we are sending back $1 trillion extra of assets, whether that's debt, real estate, equity. At the end of the day, it is claims on our future prosperity and promises to produce and pay at some later date. And if all you care about is consumption, you just want as much stuff with as little work as possible, then you'd say, this is great. If you actually want to have a highly productive economy, if you want to have innovation and growth and good jobs, if you want to have resilience and national security, you have to be concerned about what you can produce as well. And so, if you think about starting from that 3 trillion versus 4 trillion, what does it look like to bring that back toward balance? My guess is that it looks more like bringing that 4 trillion down. And in other words, producing more stuff here of the stuff that we want to consume here. And it's important to keep in mind that that's actually a little bit different from how countries typically think about adjusting their trade balance. Typically, it's countries that don't have as much domestic demand and really are looking for ways to pump up their exports. This is certainly how a lot of countries have developed and grown, where they've been successful. For the US, we have the massive domestic demand. We just decided to stop serving it from here and offshore. And so the question to an extent would be, okay, how long would it take to serve an extra $1 trillion of demand domestically? Saying, very importantly, this is not autarky. This is still $3 trillion going back and forth, but it is a dramatic increase in our domestic productive capacity, probably looking at maybe a 40% increase over where we are today. How long would that take? I think it's very useful to look at how long it took to offshore it all, which was on the order of a decade. And if you just think about what reasonable rates of growth and investment and hiring and so forth could be, I think that's the time scale you're looking at. What does it mean for your typical worker? For your typical worker, it should be said it doesn't mean a whole lot at all. Most people aren't going to be working in manufacturing. But the two things it does mean, one is it means, I think, much healthier local and regional economies. You'll have some jobs in factories. You'll also have a lot of better jobs upstream and downstream of the factory, in the community where the factory is located. And I think the quality of those jobs, both in stability and wages and so forth, are likely to be higher. The flip side is, what does it mean in terms of prices? And are we going to be paying a lot more for stuff? And I think the answer is, yeah, in some cases you will see an increase. But there are three things that I always try to emphasize about that. One is, if you're talking about an increase in about $1 trillion of stuff in a $30 trillion economy, in aggregate, it's not going to be that much. So even if you pick some products that are going to go up dramatically in price, you could essentially double the price of everything in that category, and that's only roughly a 3% increase in the price level. Over 10 years, that's a 30 basis point increase in the price level per year. So it's not zero, but it's not the sort of inflation we saw earlier in this decade, 10% in a year, this kind of thing. It is barely perceptible in the range that we see for inflation. The second thing is we'll get better at making things. asking how much would it cost to make a toaster in the US today when we gave up on making toasters isn't the relevant question. The question is, what would it cost to make toasters if that was one of the things that it made sense to bring back, and if we were actually
Does it make sense to bring back toasters?
I don't know, and that's the beautiful thing about markets is you don't actually have to decide. There might be particular strategic things. We do want to bring back chips. We need to bring back rare earths, et cetera. A lot of it, though, if you commit that you do want to reach balance and you make changes at the macroeconomic level, whether it's with tariffs, whether it's with currency, we can talk about some of the things you would do. It's then the question is at the margin, what makes, relatively speaking, most sense to do here? And which we could come back to. Last point I would just make quickly is I think it's important to think about this as a trade-off and recognize that it's a good trade-off, right? I don't think this isn't free, there are real costs here, but we made the other side of this trade-off in, roughly speaking, 2000. We said the cheap stuff is good. We're not too concerned about what that does to the structure of our labor market, what happens to our communities. Look what it's going to do for the consumer. And we've let that play out for 25 years. And what I think you see overwhelmingly in aggregate in our political system, if you actually ask people, is they feel that that was the wrong trade-off and that we should really make the other one.
So one of the preferred policy tools to try to effectuate this is tariffs. And you've written and spoken a lot about it. So what do you think is the right level of tariffs? So today, in aggregate, we're at something like a 15%-ish tariff rate. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Or somewhere in that neighborhood? Is that, if that stays in place over time, is that going to generate the kind of outcome you're looking for? Does it have to be higher? Does it have to be that we choose certain areas where it's significantly higher to drive reshoring? How do you think about looking at the current tariff policy and saying, if Oren Cass were in charge, I would do X to it to make it conform to the objective we're looking to achieve?
So I would think about what we have and what we need as really three types of tariffs, because tariffs aren't going to do this by themselves. I do think it makes sense to have a sort of global tariff, a low baseline across the board.
Like 10%.
Call it 10%, that recognizes that we actually have a preference for things produced in this country, that other things equal, there is value to the domestic production, and we would like an import to be a little bit more expensive than something domestically made.
And your view is that alone will drive some degree of increase.
Right. So to my point about sort of at the margin, okay, anything that was within 10% cost and you decided to move it offshore, that's now something that either makes sense to bring back or something in the future you wouldn't move offshore.
Are you starting to see evidence of that, given the, it's only been 6 months, but do you feel like that is going to bear out here, given that we are likely to have at a minimum a 10% baseline tariff going forward?
Yeah, I don't know that it's the 10% baseline that you're seeing drive the behavior at this point, among other things because you're not seeing any commitment to there being a permanent 10% baseline tariff. I think, and this is one piece where it would be very good to have legislation that would actually entrench this. You could have a lot more confidence that you're getting that revenue and, okay, then everyone knows that's the new baseline. I think one of the real challenges with what we've seen in implementation this year is that when it is not stable, when it is moving around, you get the costs, but you don't get the incentive to invest. Because what's going to drive investment is not the tariff today, it's what do you think the tariff is going to be in 2, 3, 5 years. So I don't know how much effect you're getting out of that at this point. Where I do think you're getting more effect is in what I would call category 2, which is what the administration has generally called these reciprocal tariffs, which is sort of, look, our trading partners that are running large imbalances with us, we are no longer going to tolerate. And the premise of those, I think, I would call them negotiating tariffs, by which I mean the premise is not that we want to have a 25% tariff on Japan in the long run, but we do really want to get Japan's attention and say, if you're not interested in a more reciprocal arrangement, this is what it's going to look like, right? You are going to be on the outside, with the goal being that we can accomplish a reciprocal relationship. And this is what you've seen in a lot of these negotiations with allies. The best way to bring trade into balance is not just with some tariff, it's actually a commitment from both sides that you want to have more balanced trade. Because if Japan actually is also committed to more balanced trade, frankly, a lot of the reason we have the imbalance is because of Japan's policies and very aggressive investment in boosting its own exports. So if Japan is willing to rethink its own currency valuation, if Japan is willing to reduce its own subsidies, if Japan is willing to tell some of its producers, hey, go serve the American market by investing and building in America, that's what's ultimately going to, I think, most effectively bring things toward balance. And that's what we saw back in the 80s. I mean, Reagan was famously protectionist toward Japan, and particularly when it came to the auto industry, it was basically conveyed to the Japanese, we will start hitting you with very large tariffs unless you stop importing so many cars into the US. And that's what sent Toyota and Honda into the American South. That's why we have the Japanese auto industry there. So I think that kind of model, we're seeing the Koreans start to think about doing with shipbuilding, these big $350, $550 billion funds, they have to be done right. But the premise is, yeah, come invest in building stuff here. And then the third bucket is the tariffs on China. And if you look at China as a country that we are not going to reach an agreement with, we are not going to find a way to balance trade, then that's a situation where actually we do want to have a long-term higher tariff that forces these economies towards decoupling. It doesn't say trade has to be zero, but does say that is a disfavored place to source from. And so I think that combination is the right approach. I do think you're starting to see significant commitments in a bunch of industries to bringing stuff back to the US. But I think the stability is really key. We do need to have a clearly established, here's what the long-term picture is going to look like, both for our allies, so we can actually reach stable agreements, and then for businesses to understand this is the context in which you're going to be investing.
Does that require a broader consensus across the American political spectrum for this approach than exists today? Because if tariffs remain a point of great contest, not just in one party, but in both parties, or certainly tariffs at this scale, can you ever actually produce the level of certainty that is necessary to drive these kind of long-term investment decisions? Or do we have to accept, having spent 4 years in the White House watching this all play out, that the lack of predictability in American policy is a feature? It's not some short-term blip. It may be a feature of America after hegemony. Yeah. So what do you do about that? I mean, if you have to accept some degree of uncertainty and unpredictability, say, I mean, you can push back on that, but let's say that's just a baseline, not just because of this administration's decisions, but because of the court, because of very strong views on the other side of this tariff argument, because of industry, because we have elections. Are we just going to end up in really choppy waters where there's a lot of costs and pain in the short term, but you don't get the long-term payoff because you don't have the level of clarity about where this is all going?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think kind of the central question in all of this, I'm relatively more optimistic, I would say, maybe because I wasn't working in the White House for a few years. But it seems to me there's a very discernible shift in the underlying consensus. And the thing about grand strategy, which is one of these like overly grand sounding terms, but exists, is that you do have to have a national consensus over time across parties. And historically the US has, right? The strategy of containment during the Cold War was broadly bipartisan and stable. This, what we might call neoliberal consensus post-Cold War, was extremely bipartisan and stable. Like you go back, look at the 2000 election and you see Al Gore and George W. Bush fighting over who's like more excited and committed to free trade with China. And I think what you see across Trump 1 to Biden to Trump 2 is a pretty dramatic sea change. I mean, certainly policy vis-a-vis China is one of the places where you see the most consistency across.
Industrial strategy is another.
Industrial strategy, just a fundamental rejection of this idea that making things doesn't matter, and a belief in reindustrialization. a willingness to use tariffs, frankly, a rejection of the WTO system. And I think if you map that onto the American public, and you forecast forward, what are future elections going to look like, I think, frankly, it's pretty impossible to envision in 2028 a major party candidate from either party sort of saying, guys, we got this wrong. We got to get back to the pre-2016 embrace of globalization in the WTO and free trade with China.
No, but you also already see President Trump just in the last week blink on coffee and some other basic staples,
yes,
right? Because this is something that actually hits real people in a real way, and they react. Prices go up, and leaders have to react to that. So the short-term pain, long-term gain theory is a good one in a democracy with frequent elections and strong political signals, and the genuine lived experience of people like, I'm paying too much at the grocery store. It creates more of a, I think, just the conversion of grand strategy into reality is much more challenging.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think it is. Trump also brings with him the baggage of just extreme negative polarization, right? You now have a Democratic Party that is sort of aggressively anti-tariff, essentially just because President Trump is aggressively pro-tariff. I mean, if you actually go through
the American people are also anti-tariff, if you pose the question to them.
I think in my experience, having done a lot of polling on this, it depends very much how you ask the question.
Yeah. They went from kind of being pro-tariff to kind of...
Well, and it depends, that's right. And it depends, right? Like you now get Republican voters now suddenly will say they are pro-tariff.
Right.
And whether you use the word tariff or not, that's the real tell, is if you use the word tariff, you will get a perfectly Republican-Democrat polarized response. If you talk about the need to reindustrialize and ask if maybe there should be a higher tax on companies that rely on imported products, you don't see the polarization and you see quite high levels of support. Now, to your point, if you ask how much more would you be willing to pay at the supermarket for that, you get a totally different answer. And so, I think certainly we are in a period of sort of instability in negotiating this. But I think where we will converge toward as we get figures of both parties in how they run their campaigns and how they govern, basically having consensus on some of this stuff and potentially, especially post-Trump, having relatively less polarization on it, I do think it is more or less where we will land. And the last thing I would say about it is that, look, the uncertainty isn't ideal. I'm one of these wonks who's like, if we could, if we had the right white paper and we all signed, that would be ideal. But
sounds like Xi Jinping a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. That is an interesting asymmetry in the relationship. But I have a colleague of mine at American Compass who always makes this point really well. He says, look, in part, we should have a lot of sympathy for businesses that are dealing with this uncertainty. On the other hand, the signal from the uncertainty and what you should take from it is actually quite clear, which is you will be better off investing and building in America.
Right.
Now, again, if you thought well, maybe Nikki Haley is going to win in 2028 and we're going to, resuscitate the WTO, that'd be crazy. But if you know the general direction we're going, and it's very funny when people talk about what was the actual effect of granting China permanent normal trade relations, the people who were responsible for this will hammer well, we didn't even change anything. We were already giving China this treatment. It's well, no, but what changed was the permanent part, right? Whether you have certainty or not drives a ton of investment behavior. And so in a sense, even though we haven't formally repealed PNTR with China, in practice we have removed the P. There is no longer any confidence that you can do business via free trade, particularly with countries that are enmeshed in a Chinese supply chain. And so I think it was just last week, GM just sent guidance out to 1,000 suppliers saying you're going to need to show us that you are no longer dependent on China. And I think we can continue to get a lot of that even as we don't have perfectly stable policy.
So I want to come on to China in a minute. But another feature of this kind of first part on balanced trade, in addition to tariffs, you've got the industrial strategy elements of the U.S. government basically playing some role in trying to ensure that in strategic industries, we are reshoring / friendshoring, and it has a range of tools at its disposal. And I think you and I both are believers in industrial strategy. There are really hard cases, though, and Intel is one of them. So you've got a company that has challenges. We put a lot of money into it. Now we have an equity stake in it. Can you talk about whether you think that this bet on Intel is a good bet or not a good bet? And I use this case rather than just sort of generically talking about it, because where the rubber hits the road on industrial policy is not just kind of at the theory level, but you got to make bets. And we've made a bet as a government across 2 administrations on Intel. Is that a good bet?
Well, President Trump is up 100%. He's crushing the market on his Intel investment.
On the investment, right, okay. But
no, I think it's a great question. I think it's very important to assess industrial strategy at the portfolio level.
Yeah.
Like, I think anybody who is asking, a set of government subsidies or investments or whatever form it takes to bat 1,000 or even 500 is entirely missing the point. The question should be, are we getting a good return on investment? And that's how anyone in the private sector thinks about investing. And if the rationale for the government to be driving public investment is we have a set of activities that we think would have a very positive return on investment, at least at the social level, even if it's not generating the kind of private return on investment that's going to attract a lot of capital, then that's how we should assess the policy. And so the question should be, how's the CHIPS Act doing, right? And there's, of course, the end science part of the CHIPS Act, which is an extra $200 billion that got tacked on. I'm talking about the actual roughly $40 billion committed to chip makers to get them to build plants in the US. That was essentially spread across everybody that could potentially do that, all 5 major, both logic and memory chip makers. And I think the answer is already, essentially, it is an unquestionable success. Just the amount of private capital we have crowded in at TSMC in Arizona. TSMC is now sort of online, at scale, with yields equal to or better than they're getting in Taiwan, doing the kind of chip fabrication that had just left our shores entirely. I think we're going to see the same thing from Samsung in Texas. I think we're seeing the same thing with Micron. On the memory side.
So your argument is whether Intel succeeds or fails, the overall enterprise works, and so that's an acceptable cost if it doesn't succeed.
Right. So even if Intel ends up being a 0, the CHIPS Act would still be successful. I think it's perfectly reasonable to look at the CHIPS office and say, well, wait a minute, was this the right way to do it? Should we have had some threshold of proof of capability? Should we have had more milestones you had to hit before you get the money? We can always do better. But the question at the end of the day can't be, did you execute this perfectly with 0 loss? The question should be, was this better than not doing it? Okay. And there, I think, certainly with chips, we're squarely into the yes territory.
So 2 questions on the second pillar, which is the burden owning when it comes to defense. I think I heard you say, but correct me if I'm wrong, that Japan, Korea, and Australia should take on a significantly larger burden of deterring China. I mean, is that really plausible that those 3 countries, even if they were operating at maximum capability, could deter China? Doesn't the United States have to play a really significant role in deterring China in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think so. I mean, the question would be, what would it look like if Japan, Korea, and Australia were actually making the investments they needed to, and let's be very concrete, to defend Taiwan? I think one very interesting reference point we now have is how easy was it for Russia to invade Ukraine? And the answer was, actually, it is extremely hard to take territory, even not crossing a body of water, if the goal is to prevent China from capturing Taiwan. The U.S. should absolutely play a role. There are unique assets that the U.S. has. If Japan, Korea, and Australia had all been committing 5% of GDP over the last decade or 2 to defense, I have no doubt that they could defend Taiwan. I mean, one interesting benchmark is like what share, like obviously the US is larger and wealthier, but we are trying to do 5 things at once. What share of US resources have we actually committed to Taiwan? And if we were committing our technology and so forth, but less equipment and personnel, what share would you need from an Australia, Japan, and Korea that only had to worry about that? And so I think it's plausible. The question is, would they do it? And ultimately, I think that's sort of up to them. I think we have spent a lot of time in a world where the US has simply said, we will not get up from the table. We will cajole, we will encourage, but at the end of the day, we have nowhere else. We will not walk away. And other countries, to their credit, have behaved entirely rationally in being like, cool, well then we are gonna sort of do a self-enfeeblement and you're going to have to do the rest. And I fear that we have been stuck for a very long time in a sort of normative world where we ask, what should the United States do, instead of being in the descriptive world of what can we actually do.
So now, if Japan, Korea, and Australia are basically responsible for defense and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, their incentive to come with us on the ex-China part, as opposed to go ahead and hedge with China, goes way down. Is that fair?
Or it goes way up. Why does it go way down?
Well, because now they're not getting the benefit of the American security commitment. They've got China with a massive military and nuclear weapons, which they don't have, although maybe they get under the approach you're describing. And their trade ties with China are extremely deep and growing. So one would think the natural, if you're sitting there in Tokyo or Seoul or Canberra, well, if I'm not getting the additional benefit of a security relationship with the United States, and I'm just looking at this purely both, I don't want to get into a war with China, so I got to reduce tensions with them, and because they're right next door, and my trade and economic relationship with them is massive. Surely it would at least raise the question for them, if I got to choose one side or the other, and the Americans have just removed the security guarantee, it's going to be tough for them, isn't it?
Well, let's not conflate security guarantee and security relationship. You're still getting a security relationship. You're still getting a United States that is spending in absolute terms way more than you are on defense.
But with no promise of defending you.
With no promise of defending you while you do nothing.
In fact, not just no promise, the withdrawal of a promise. Like, we were previously promising to defend you, now we're not.
No, it's not a withdrawal of the promise. It is a change of the conditions, because it is reciprocal. It is that if we are going to be in a security alliance together, you actually need to be doing your part. And that is what your part looks like, is taking the lead on security in your region. And the question for a Japan or a Korea or an Australia, and ultimately we'll see the same thing in Europe, is, well, are you open to becoming a protectorate of China or not? I mean, I have no question that in the short run, like, China's offering a great deal, right? We won't invade, we won't attack you, we'll send you lots of cheap stuff, and in fact take all of your industry, and won't it be great? I think if you have countries out there that are looking at the 21st century and thinking, honestly, as between being in a US orbit or a China orbit, we're kind of indifferent and we think we get more cheap stuff from China, then yeah, we're going to lose them. But we're going to lose them anyway. I don't see any prospect of a productive alliance for the United States with countries that really are indifferent to whether they remain market democracies or not.
Okay, last question for me before we open up, and it's a big question, which is, in your third pillar, it's really advocating for a hard break with China. So can you just take a minute to describe what does a world look like after a hard break? What is the size and scope of the trading relationship, if there is even one? And is this kind of decoupling at this quite dramatic level that you described? Do you think this is feasible, and at what cost?
Well, I think the way to think of it is much closer to the relationship that we had with the Soviet Union. And, I think...
Which was virtually zero trade, right?
Which was, at least until the 70s, virtually zero trade.
Yeah.
And it's important to keep in mind that everyone took for granted that that was the right choice, right? Like, not even Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were out there saying, like, well, free trade is good, so we should have free trade with the Soviet Union. It was understood that it was obviously a nonsensical non-starter to think that you were going to have an integrated market with a authoritarian non-market adversary. The only reason, let's keep in mind, that we moved toward integration with China in the first place was because we had unbounded confidence that once we started to integrate, they would democratize and liberalize. I think it's a very interesting hypothetical to go back and ask, if you could tell the people in 1998, 1999 who were promoting integration with China, here's what China is going to look like in 2025, would they still say, that's great, let's go for it? Some of them might, but they sure as hell would have had to come up with a different rationale than the one they were using. And so I do think it's important to recognize that there is just no, I believe, example in world history of actually successfully integrating two economies that have such different, two markets that have such different economic and political systems. And I think, the long-term costs to the US if we don't do something about it are dramatically higher. The quintessential example I put to people is just, the auto industry. I mean, China's goal is to essentially produce so many cars that it is in a position to wipe out the US auto industry. And there are still economists out there today, some of them teaching at Harvard, who would say, well, that's an interesting question if that's okay or not. I'm just like, that's not an interesting question at all. That is a self-evidently absurd outcome.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that with that on the economic side, and then on the political side, the very simple problem that if you have a capitalist system in which firms are supposed to do whatever maximizes their profit, and what maximizes their profit is kowtowing to the CCP, that is what they will do. And they have shown that they will do that. And that's just not really compatible with our political system, let alone our economic system. So, I think it is almost inevitably going to happen and should happen. I think the cost of it is not nearly as high as people make it out to be, because this again goes back to the point about, $1 trillion out of a, $30 trillion economy. Our trade with China is just not that large a share of our economy. And sourcing the stuff that we source from China from elsewhere, it can be from other developing countries, it can be, I think Mexico is obviously a very important trade partner for us. There are other ways to do this stuff.
But at the end of the road, it's not just us decoupling, right? In your vision, Europe decouples, India decouples, Japan decouples, Korea decouples, right? So that's a pretty significant disruption of global supply chains. If it's not just the US and China bilaterally going the other way and there's a reorientation.
No, that's right. And I think in a lot of cases, some of the costs are going to be bigger for some of them. But also the threats that they're under are bigger in a lot of ways. I mean, Germany is the quintessential example now where, as we have put up trade barriers to China, China's export surplus is starting to flow elsewhere, including into Europe. You have Germany now down below 2005 industrial output and starting to realize they are now going to have to choose. And so a little bit to your point about, well, like what will make sense for a Japan or a Korea, for any of these countries, I think it is a difficult situation that they are facing. Frankly, I understand why they're very angry at the US for moving away from benevolent hegemony. But I also think it's worth noticing that two things at the end of the day. One is, look, the US offer, and one of the reasons it's so much more attractive than the China offer, is that it actually is reciprocal. The US is not asking these countries to do anything that the US is not also going to do, right? We're not asking that we get to be the exporter now and they absorb our surpluses. We're not saying we don't want to spend on any on defense, you all defend us. We're not saying we like trade with China, but you have to get China out. It actually is therefore, it is not a client-state relationship. It is a genuinely reciprocal relationship. And the other thing is that I think, while these are substantively and politically painful in various ways, it's worth noticing that this will frankly be good for these countries as well, that the German and Japan model of export surpluses into the US, dependence on China, at this point has run out for their economies. They're facing very challenging economic stagnation. I don't think, Germany's somewhat acknowledged this, but I think these countries wish they actually did have their own defense capacity and could advance their interests. And I think they can all see what is coming down the road with China if they don't do something about it. So it is not an easy transition, but I think it's an extraordinarily necessary one, and what makes it plausible is that you actually can see through to the mutual benefit for the participants.
Okay, we're going to take some questions. So if people have questions, I think we have microphones lined up at the back here, and we'll start right here.
You have to give the instruction about how it has to be a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. It has to be it has to be a question.
Thank you for coming, Oren. I will limit it to a question. I have so many. But I guess as I'm sure you know, U.S. manufacturing as a whole has not declined. U.S. manufacturing employment has declined. I think you're right to focus on the idea of people as more than consumers, because obviously people's lives are much more than what they consume. But I guess my question is, how do you think about the role of technology in all this? Most of the decline in U.S. manufacturing employment has been because of technological advances that have reduced the number of workers you need. It strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about in competition is sort of about advancing American technological interests and our ability to out-innovate China in certain ways. I guess with a particular lens of AI, if you want, or not if you don't want, how do you think about whether American workers are just going to get crushed more by technology than by outsourcing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will start by rejecting all of your premises.
Sure.
So U.S. manufacturing has declined. Since the start of the great financial crisis, certainly, just measures of industrial output are down. Certainly our leadership, it's the Australian Something Defense Institute was looking at just our leadership across key technologies. We've gone from leading in 57 to China leading in 60 out of 64. I mean, there's been a complete shift in technological leadership, and you've seen productivity in manufacturing, not just slower growth, it has declined for more than a decade. We literally need more workers in factories to produce the same output. So between that and the very clear loss of leadership, what's happened to a Boeing or a GE or an Intel, I think it's impossible to make the case that sort of U.S. manufacturing remains stable or strong or isn't in decline. The related point then about, we lost the jobs because of technology, I think it's very important to notice that it is a question of baselines. And what I mean by that is that if you look over time, we've always had great productivity growth in the manufacturing sector, which is how we measure automation. In fact, we automated, got more productivity growth. We got more of that in the 1947 and 1972 period, in the 1973 to 2000 period, than we have gotten since 2000. What has changed, though, is that we used to get productivity growth and automation, and with that, more output. So, we could double what the people in the factory could produce. That's great. Let's make twice as much stuff. We can now also pay everybody twice as much. That has shifted to a model in which, if we are automating, we are just, therefore, hiring fewer people. And so if you assume a baseline of flat output, then you would be correct. What has caused the job loss is productivity gains. But if you assume that actually the baseline should be rising output in line with rising domestic demand, in line with rising GDP, then actually very close to 100% of the job loss is the delta in the output. Because what's changed over time is not how quickly technology is automating things. What's changed is that we went from an economy of growing output to an economy of offshoring. And that's where it comes back to this question of what would it look like to fix this? Closing that trade deficit almost looks exactly like getting back on the line of output growth that we were on before we shifted to the offshoring model. And so just kind of the punchline for this is what that means is that, yes, absolutely, if we reindustrialize, this will be much more automated, higher tech, fewer workers in any given factory. That's fine. It still means way more workers than we have now in the no factory. And it is exactly the model of rising and broad-based prosperity, where, from the 50s to 2000, we actually roughly had the same number of manufacturing jobs. So as a share of jobs, it was declining, but as a number of jobs, as acres and communities up, it was holding steady, and then it fell off. If we can get back to that, it's going to be as important for other jobs as it is for the jobs in the factories, but it's going to be a much healthier economy, I think.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Zihua, and I'm a graduate student with TH Chen School of Public Health. So my question is, since you have been talking about China, have you ever thought or even think of China probably is not as strong as you may think? Because in China, there are still 600 million people living in poverty, and only a little bit, probably more than 10% of Chinese population reach to the level of middle class per U.S. standard. So what do you think of that way, when you were talking about China is rivaling with U.S. in so many perspectives?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it connects in a way to the question about, is it actually plausible for Japan, Australia, Korea, maybe we get India involved to deter China? I think China as an economic power, as a military power, is absolutely deterrable. But the things that you just described are not an argument that China does not pose a massive economic threat to the US economic model. If anything, it underscores how much room there is still to run, right? If this is what we've seen, even as you still have what you were just describing, there is still sort of an enormous wave yet to crash if you let China continue with the model it has. And I think importantly, in some ways actually, Chinese economic weakness poses a bigger threat. And just what I mean by that very specifically is you're starting to see China, because of its overinvestment in manufacturing, because of these massive export surpluses, you're starting to see deflation in the Chinese economy. Typically, if you had a country that massively overbuilt its manufacturing capacity, let's say, you'd say, ooh, that's going to be that country's going to suffer some real pain. What China is doing instead, and what we can expect to do, is export that pain. It can take that and is trying to convert that into market share. And the classic term is, from a trade perspective, is beggar thy neighbor, that you can literally export your unemployment to other countries. And if countries like Germany say, no, well, we're kind of still committed to free trade, we certainly don't want to fight with China, so I guess we're just going to buy all of these Chinese vehicles, that's just going to be trading German jobs for Chinese jobs. So I think, we are so used to analyzing the global economy on the assumption that at the end of the day, everybody's a liberal market economy. And the reality is that's not the case. And China as it exists, regardless of whatever challenges it has, creates just a lot of distortions and problems.
Yeah.
Hi, Oren. Thanks for being here today. I feel like I hear a lot of Republicans talking about, especially my youth, picking winners and picking losers. And I know that I've heard you also say, I think on some podcast or in class here, that tariffs are a more free market management strategy for reshoring national security. Do you see other fiscal policies playing a role in industrial strategy in American policy? And do you also see monetary policy playing a role in grand strategy for America?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it connects to the Intel question earlier, because I think, from a sort of what is the ideal policy, also just from a political economy perspective, what do you want Congress doing versus what do you not want it doing, to the extent that you can have very sort of broad-based neutral policies, I think you're going to be better off. So a tariff says, we're altering the playing field in this way. Now market, go figure out what it makes sense to move around. I think there's a case in these strategic sectors we were talking about for saying, look, if what you really want is more chip plants in the US, at some point it's going to make more sense to just pay people to build chip plants in the US than to try to have some global strategy to just hope it kind of manifests. But I think there are a bunch of other things you can do. So, one example is sort of local content requirements, right? Either for particular industries or overall, you can just say there are benefits or advantages to having more local content in your product. That's just going to create demand for people to make stuff domestically without a perspective to what stuff it makes most sense to do domestically. I think there's also stuff that's very horizontal that's more like better workforce training, right? That's just going to benefit anybody who needs different skills. And then I think the monetary policy side is really interesting, because one thing we didn't discuss at all, but that is implicated by a lot of this is, do we still want the US to be the reserve currency? Is it plausible that the US would be a global reserve currency in a world where there are two spheres, in a world where even within a US bloc, the US is insisting on balanced trade? It's our, the flip side of the current account is the capital account. That's everybody wanting lots of dollars. From my perspective, there are two things to be said. One is, just like money is both a store of value and a medium of exchange, so is being the reserve currency. And there's no reason you can't continue to be the medium of exchange while refusing to be the world's store of value. So I suspect actually that at least certainly within a US sphere, the dollar would remain the preferred means, just given our relative size and stability. But I think more broadly, it's important to say, in a lot of ways, being the reserve currency is closer to an exorbitant burden than an exorbitant privilege. If what you care about is being able to borrow a lot and consume a lot on credit and having a killer financial sector on Wall Street, then yeah, super important, strong dollar reserve currency. If what you care about is a strong economy with balanced growth and good outcomes for workers throughout the country, I'm not really sure why you want to be a reserve currency. And it's certainly important to say that a strong dollar, meaning a higher valued dollar, is not helpful for its own sake. Strong dollar should mean stable, fairly valued, not as expensive as possible.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Hi, Bethany Russell. I'm a joint degree student between the Kennedy School and the Business School, and I wanted to press a little bit more on the feasibility of asking allies and partners to decouple completely from China. China over the last decade has lent $2.1 trillion to the rest of the world, so decoupling would lead to a massive investment gap that the US is not ready to step in and fill. China also provides certain goods to the rest of the world, from critical minerals to batteries, so decoupling will lead to component shortages that will have trickle-down effects throughout the rest of the economy. And as we mentioned earlier, China has driven down the cost of goods, so decoupling will lead to higher prices for consumers, which will have an outsized impact on lower-income countries with whom we're allies and partners. So is it realistic to ask allies and partners to pay more to decouple from China? How do we fill in some of these gaps as we move away from China? And especially, how do we convince allies and partners to decouple in an area where US foreign policy is a little unpredictable and at times illogical?
It's a great question. I would start by distinguishing the other major developed countries that we've been talking about from smaller developing countries, because certainly when it comes to capital, a lot of these major developed countries are not the ones relying on investment from China. To the contrary, they have excess savings. It is the US that is then the recipient of that. And so it's actually the US that's going to face the constraint of, we actually are going to need to do some more saving and investing relative to consumption. That's on the order of probably 2 or 3% of GDP. So that's, on one hand, like massive compared to what we've been doing. On the other hand, it's 2 to 3%. It's not some sort of catastrophic shift. It's where you'd be in 1 or 2 years anyway. So I don't worry, for developed countries anyway, about China as the funder. And then to the extent you're sort of describing the supply chain dependencies, I think that sort of cuts both ways. That also underscores the need to do this, that countries are increasingly becoming cognizant of, and as especially over the last year, China starts to actually threaten to use some of these things as weapons. So I think you're already seeing, a obviously aggressive effort to break the dependency on China on critical minerals. I think you'll see the same thing very soon on pharmaceuticals. Batteries is a little bit trickier and will take longer, but also you have this same set of countries rethinking how quickly they can push ahead with electrifying everything, given the need to reindustrialize. So, on all of those things, I think it's very addressable for the major developed countries. Developing countries is a different question, and that is where I think, among other things, you could very reasonably see the U.S. in partnership with these other developed countries offer a different deal. I think the big concern you have there, and this is, you remember there were all the jokes about why are there reciprocal tariffs on Madagascar or the random island with only the penguins, right? The problem is transshipment. The problem is if you say, oh, don't worry, small developing country, you can keep doing your own thing, pretty soon you're gonna have $100 billion of stuff stamped with that country's label that looks really Chinese. And so, my expectation would be that the offer to those sorts of countries would look much more like, look, you can maintain relationships you have today with China. Our critical supply chains aren't moving through you already. You're not transmitting big imbalances already. But please be aware, if that imbalance starts to go up a whole bunch, there is going to be a problem. And so I think you can do that sort of thing very compatible with the broader reciprocity framework.
Okay, we have time for, I'm afraid, one more question. We'll take it from up here.
Hi, I'm Sihu, a student in the college, and my question that you mentioned that Japan, Korea, and Australia should protect Taiwan from the invasion of China, but how can they guarantee that they can defend themselves when China is invading in, let's say, the Southeast Asia or somewhere in the Pacific? Because, for example, there is a strait between PRC and Taiwan, but there is not a strait between China and Korea. So how can they guarantee their own national security?
I guess I would say two things about this. One is I just want to highlight the extent to which we all take for granted that China is this bad and destabilizing actor in the global system. Which always seems to only sort of strangely come up when we're questioning moving to this sort of reciprocal system, not when it should come up, which is why we're questioning the bizarre inclusion of China in the global system, right? Like I was doing a panel with the Financial Times, so it was a bunch of European folks, and they were pushing this point, maybe Europe should turn away from the US and towards China, US is being so unreliable. Well, what were their big ways in which US was being unreliable? We weren't aggressively defending Ukraine enough from a Russian invasion being actively supported by China, and we weren't signaling a strong enough commitment to protecting Taiwan from an invasion from China. So the idea that what people are going to do instead is try to buffer this by just going with China doesn't make any sense. Can these other countries deter China in a sort of balanced two-sphere system? I think the answer is yes. And again, I think it's very interesting whether you just sort of think about it conceptually, historically over time, what did the Soviet Union actually succeed in doing, right? There were some interesting proxy wars all over the world. The Soviet Union, despite being extremely expansionist, now obviously the US had a much more aggressive commitment around the world in that period. But we just don't have a lot of examples in a very long time of one country sort of successfully invading another developed economy with a robust defense sector. We barely have examples of them successfully invading. As I said, Russia even can't actually successfully get very far in Ukraine. And so, my view is that this is extraordinarily plausible. And that also, from the Chinese perspective, it doesn't look all that appealing. Is the theory here China is actually going to invade South Korea or Japan? I don't think so. I think we would actually have a much more stable situation if China were granted a sphere, and there was a sphere that was clearly committed to its own common defense, and that would be a lot more stable if the people on the front lines were the people who actually had the most stake in executing that defense, instead of today when everybody is relying on the US. And the big question for China is like, does it really think the US would come to Taiwan's defense? I think it would be a lot better off if China had to think like, oh no, there is a set of countries that is definitely going to come to Taiwan's defense.
So I know there are more questions out there. I'm sorry that we don't have a chance to get to them, but I'm going to take the privilege, even though we're at 7:06, of asking you one unrelated question, which is that you've done a lot to challenge orthodoxy on your side in the Republican kind of economic world. Where are you on the question of raising taxes on wealthy people in this country to raise revenue to deal with some of these debt problems? Is that something you think is a good idea or a bad idea?
Oh, definitely a good idea. We did a lot of work challenging various parts of the One Big Beautiful Bill even, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about these imbalances, the US fiscal deficit is a huge part of the problem. It is almost impossible to envision closing the trade deficit while you are running a $2 trillion fiscal deficit, to the earlier point that the US is the one that actually needs to do more saving and domestic investing. And so, I think just as a matter of fiscal responsibility, and also as we think about some of these additional investments we need to be making, part of what we are talking about is an economic rebalancing that is going to require a heavier burden on those who have been the winners at the high income end. So that's something that we argue for very aggressively. Obviously, there is not a Congress today on the Republican side that is open to that. There is an administration, right? Trump and Bessent both said when everything was stuck, like, how about raising the top rate? And the balance of Republicans in Congress today is not ready to do that. But I think the administration is a much better indicator of the direction the party is headed. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that we will have a Republican Party. It's not going to be in the same place as the Democratic Party, but that is much more willing to take seriously the revenue side of this picture as part of what needs to be addressed.
Interesting. Please give it up for Oren Cass.
Thank you very much. This was awesome. Thank you.